The gavel struck the weathered plywood podium with a sound like a rifle shot, echoing across a yard frozen by the first bite of November. It was barely 6 in the morning. The air was a gray shroud of mist and diesel exhaust, smelling of cold grease and the bitter sweat of a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. Elias Thorne stood by the fence line, his shadow long and thin against the red barn that had belonged to his grandfather. Everything he owned was tagged with a yellow number. The tractors, the seed drills, the very wrenches he used to keep the world spinning. The bank called it a liquidation. The neighbors called it a tragedy. But as the first lot was called, something strange happened. Elias didn't lower his head. He stepped forward. Before the sun had even cleared the ridge, the man who lost everything began to buy it all back for pennies. If you believe the land remembers its own, subscribe to Beyond the Fields and stay with us until the morning mist clears. The real price of a man's soul was about to be tallied. The soil on the Thorne place isn't like the black, easy dirt you find further south. It's a stubborn, heavy clay that fights back. It's a red earth that stains your boots and works its way under your fingernails until you can't scrub it out. For 80 years, the Thorne family had been in a wrestling match with that clay. Elias remembered his father pointing to a gnarled oak at the edge of the north pasture, telling him that a man's life is only as deep as his roots. If you don't dig in, the wind will carry you off like chaff. Elias had dug in. He'd spent 40 years waking up before the birds, feeling the cold floorboards on his feet, and heading out to the barn with a lantern. He knew every tick and groan of his John Deere 4020. He knew which fence posts were rotting and which ones would hold through a blizzard. This wasn't just a business to him. It was a living, breathing history. Every bushel of corn he harvested felt like a debt paid to the ancestors who cleared this timber with nothing but hand saws and mules. He remembered the drought of '88, when the ground cracked open like a parched throat and the crops withered into brown ribbons. He'd stayed then, hauling water by hand, refusing to let the land die on his watch. He had buried his father in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, and on that day, he'd whispered a promise to the wind that the name Thorne would remain etched in this dirt as long as the sun rose. But the world changed. The seasons became more erratic. The prices of seed and fuel climbed like a mountain, and the interest rates began to chew at the edges of his peace. He'd taken out a loan to modernize, to keep pace with the big corporate outfits that were swallowing the small farms whole. He'd put the land up as collateral, never imagining that a string of bad harvests and a global shift in the market would put the hammer in the hands of a stranger. This ground was soaked in his sweat, his father's sweat, and the tears of his mother during the hard winters. To the bank, it was just a series of coordinates on a map and a balance sheet that didn't add up. To Elias, it was the very marrow in his bones. He walked the perimeter of the field the night before the auction, feeling the stubble of the harvested corn beneath his boots. The air was deathly still. He touched the rusted wire of the fence, thinking about the thousands of hours he'd spent right here, mending, planting, and hoping. A man works the land, but eventually the land works the man. It shapes his hands into calloused tools and carves lines into his face like the furrows of a plowed field. He wasn't just losing a house or a tractor. He was losing his identity. He was being stripped of the only thing that made him feel like he belonged in this world. The heavy clay felt cold and indifferent, but Elias knew it better than he knew his own reflection. he knew that the clay was patient. It had outlived the buffalo and the pioneers, and it would outlive the men in suits. He just didn't know if he would be the one left to see it. He sat on the porch as the moon climbed high, watching the shadows of the machinery he might never touch again. He thought about the grain bin he'd built with his brother, the one that still had their initials scratched into the concrete base. He thought about the morning his daughter was born, and how he'd stepped outside to see the wheat waving in the breeze like a golden ocean. All of that history, all of that labor, was being reduced to a series of lots and bid increments. The roots were deep, but the storm was finally here, and it was a storm made of paper and ink, cold and relentless. The bank sent a man named Miller. He arrived in a black SUV that looked like a polished beetle against the backdrop of the rusted barn. Miller didn't wear boots. He wore thin-soled Italian loafers that were never meant to touch anything more rugged than a marble lobby. He stepped out of the vehicle and immediately grimaced at the smell of the manure pile and the damp earth. To Miller, this farm was a distressed asset. It was a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be resolved before the quarterly report. He looked at Elias not as a neighbor or a fellow man, but as an obstacle to efficiency. Miller carried a leather briefcase and a tablet that flickered with data points. He moved through the yard with an air of clinical detachment, marking items with orange tape as if he were tagging carcasses in a butcher shop. When Elias tried to speak to him, to explain that a little more time was all he needed, Miller didn't even look up from his screen. He spoke in a voice that was as flat and cold as a sheet of ice. He talked about liquidity, depreciation, and contractual obligations. He treated the decades of Thorne history as if they were irrelevant anecdotes. He viewed the dusty equipment as scrap metal that needed to be converted into cash to satisfy the board of directors. To Miller, the arrogance of wealth was a shield. He believed that money was the only true language, and since Elias didn't have enough of it, Elias was effectively silent. Miller stood by the auctioneer, whispering instructions, his eyes scanning the crowd of locals who had gathered. He saw them as a collection of rubes, people who didn't understand the complexities of global finance. He expected them to watch the proceedings with a dull, defeated acceptance. He had seen this 100 times before. A farm fails, the bank comes in, the equipment is sold to the highest bidder, and the land is eventually carved up for development or sold to a massive agricultural conglomerate. It was the natural order of things in his world. He didn't see the way the local farmers looked at him, with a quiet, simmering heat that was far more dangerous than an open flame. He didn't notice the way they stood close to Elias, their shoulders square and their eyes hard. Miller was too busy calculating the projected recovery percentage. He had already called his superiors to tell them the auction would be a success. He viewed the auction as a formality, a public display of the bank's power. He wanted it over quickly so he could get back to the city, away from the smell of the earth and the heavy silence of the country. He represented the corporate greed that didn't care about the soul of a place, only the yield it could produce. He was the man in the polished shoes, walking over the dreams of a man who had spent his life in the dirt. And he did it without a single second of hesitation or a shred of empathy. He was the embodiment of the force that was trying to tear Elias away from his heritage. As the clock ticked toward 7, the auction began in earnest. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic chant, a staccato blur of numbers and filler words that filled the yard. It was a sound that usually signaled a new beginning, a fair trade, but today it sounded like a funeral dirge. The crowd was larger than expected. There were men in expensive fleece jackets from 3 counties over, men who smelled of money and opportunity. They were the scavengers, the ones who made a living buying up the misfortune of others at a discount. They circled the equipment, kicking tires and checking engine hours with a cold, predatory interest. They looked at Elias's Massey Ferguson and his grain wagons as if they were just bargains to be exploited. Elias stood in the center of it all, a man stripped to the bone. Every piece of equipment being sold represented a season of his life. That boiler had been his companion through the hottest July on record. That plow had broken the ground for 10 different crops. Watching them be paraded in front of a group of strangers was a public humiliation that cut deeper than any physical wound. The wealthy buyers laughed among themselves, making jokes about the antiques on the property. They didn't see the repairs Elias had made with baling wire and sheer will. They didn't see the care he'd taken to grease every fitting and change every filter. To them, it was just junk to be flipped for a profit. The bank agent, Miller, stood on the periphery, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as the first few items sold for decent prices. He felt validated. The system was working. He watched Elias, expecting to see the man break, to see him turn away in shame, or perhaps even plead one last time. But Elias remained remarkably still. He watched each transaction with a terrifying intensity. The humiliation was there, thick and heavy in the air. But there was something else beneath it, a quiet, steady resolve. The locals didn't bid. They stood with their hands in their pockets, their hats pulled low against the morning chill. When a wealthy buyer from the city would place a bid, the auctioneer would look to the crowd of local farmers searching for a counter, but he found only a wall of silence. The tension began to grow. The scavengers started to feel the weight of those silent stares. It's one thing to buy a tractor at a bank sale. It's another to do it while 50 men who knew the owner are watching you with eyes that say, "You aren't welcome here." The arrogance of the outsiders began to flicker. They realized that they weren't just at an auction. They were in a community, and they were the intruders. Elias took a step closer to the podium as the big-ticket items came up. This was the moment of total exposure, where the heart of the farm was put on the block. The hum of the crowd died down, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the rafters of the open shed. Then came the shift that no one in a polished shoe could have predicted. The auctioneer called out the first of the major tractors, a well-maintained workhorse that should have fetched $30,000 easily. One of the outside buyers raised his hand for a high opening bid. Suddenly, a local farmer named Silas, who lived 3 miles down the road, cleared his throat and offered a bid of exactly $1. The auctioneer paused, confused. He looked for a higher bid from the outsider. The outsider started to raise his hand, but then he looked around. He saw the way Silas was looking at him. He saw 20 other farmers move a half-step closer, a silent, unbreakable human wall. The outsider lowered his hand. He didn't bid again. The auctioneer called for more bids, his voice wavering. No one spoke. The silence was deafening. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman for $1. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it wasn't a murmur of surprise. It was a murmur of agreement. The next lot was a combine, a massive machine worth a fortune. Again, the opening bid from a stranger was met with a penny bid from a neighbor. When the stranger tried to outbid him, the local community didn't say a word. They just stared. It was a collective act of defiance, a nonverbal pact that had been forged in the diners and barns over the last week. They had decided that they would not let their friend be cannibalized by the bank. One by one, the items were sold for pennies to the neighbors. The scavengers, sensing a hostility they couldn't fight with a checkbook, began to retreat. They slunk back to their trucks, realizing that no piece of machinery was worth the price of being an outcast in this valley. Elias stood there, and for the first time in weeks, his hands stopped shaking. He watched as his community systematically dismantled the bank's plan. They were buying back his life, piece by piece, and they were doing it for the price of a cup of coffee. This was the solidarity of the soil. These were men who had traded labor, shared equipment, and stood by each other through floods and fires. They understood that if Elias fell, a part of them fell too. The bank thought they were dealing with an individual, but they were actually dealing with a tribe. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. By refusing to bid against each other and intimidating the outsiders, they ensured that the total recovery for the bank would be a pittance. The tools of the trade were staying exactly where they belonged. Elias looked at Silas, and the old man just gave a nearly imperceptible nod. No words were needed. The ledger was being rewritten by the hands that actually worked the earth. The power of the bank was evaporating in the face of a community that valued a man more than a debt. It was a slow, methodical reclamation. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the yard was still full of the same equipment, but the ownership had technically changed hands to people who had no intention of taking it away. Miller's face turned a shade of white that matched his starched collar. He was frantic now, pacing back and forth behind the auctioneer, his tablet forgotten on the hood of his SUV. He tried to interrupt, claiming that the bidding was a sham, that there was collusion happening right in front of him. But the auctioneer, a man who had grown up in these parts and knew the law to the letter, simply shrugged. "A bid is a bid, Mr. Miller. There's no law that says a man has to pay more than he wants to." Miller looked out at the sea of weathered faces and realized he had been completely outmaneuvered. He had come here thinking he was the smartest person in the room, the one with the leverage and the authority. He had treated Elias like a defeated peasant, but now he was the one looking small. He had to call his office and explain why an auction that was supposed to bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars had barely cleared enough to pay for the gas he'd used to drive there. The arrogance he'd carried all morning had curdled into a bitter, humiliating defeat. He tried to threaten the crowd, mentioning legal action and conspiracy. But his voice cracked, and it carried no weight against the solid reality of the men standing before him. He was a man of paper, and he was being torn apart by men of stone. He watched as the neighbors began to walk up to Elias, one by one, handing over the titles and bills of sale they had just acquired for pennies. They were giving it all back. For less than the price of a used truck, Elias Thorne owned his farm again. Miller's world was built on the idea that everything has a price and that the highest bidder always wins. He didn't understand that some things are not for sale. He didn't understand that the value of a man's reputation among his peers is a currency that doesn't fluctuate with the market. He had been served a harvest of humble pie, and it was a bitter fruit to swallow. As he climbed back into his SUV, his shoes now caked in the very red clay he had despised, he didn't look back. He drove away, a disgraced messenger of a system that had failed to account for the human spirit. The silence that followed his departure was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever heard. The roar of the corporate machine had been silenced by the quiet power of a few good men. Elias stood by his Massey Ferguson, his hand resting on the warm metal of the hood. He looked at the bank's orange tape and peeled it off, crumpling it into a small ball and dropping it into the dirt. The auction was over. The equipment hadn't moved an inch, but the world had shifted back onto its axis. He was still a farmer. He was still a thorn. And he was still standing on the ground that held his father's bones. True value isn't something you can capture on a ledger or transmit in a wire transfer. It's found in the quiet strength of a neighbor's handshake and the unyielding resilience of a man who refuses to let go of the land that made him. The bank saw a failing business. The community saw a brother. They proved that while the powerful might own the paper, the people own the earth. Elias Thorne went back to work that afternoon. The sun was warm on his back as he turned the key in his tractor, the engine roaring to life with a defiant, steady beat. He didn't just buy back his equipment, he reclaimed his dignity. In the end, the legacy of a farm isn't written in profits or losses, but in the dirt itself, a story of survival, grit, and the unbreakable bonds of those who know that the soul of the land is worth more than any price a man in polished shoes could ever name. The clay remains, the roots hold fast, and the thorn name stays right where it belongs. Beyond the fields, the truth remains. You can't auction a man's spirit.